Let's show some love to our next speaker, Emmett Nahil. Emmett is a writer, a narrative designer, and also the co-founder of Perfect Garbage Studios. He cares about intersectional analysis and bringing more diverse representation to other queer Middle Easterners. And he also digs weird fiction. So without further ado, can we see some hype in chat for Emmett?
Hi, GDSC. My name's Emmett, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about chillers, killers, and thrillers, how a horror writer brings scenecraft into games. Right. You might be wondering, who's this guy? Who is he? I'm the narrative director at Perfect Garbage Studios. I'm also the head writer and narrative designer on Love Shore, our first game, as well as another sort of secret project. I do freelance narrative design and other sort of titles as well, and I'm a general horror guy, comic writer, and novelist. So, as per the title, what is scenecraft anyway? You might be wondering. Uh, it sounds pretty self-explanatory, and it kind of is. It's just the art of making scenes in fiction and the art of constructing them. So there are a few like sort of tenets that need to sort of be hit when we talk about what makes a scene. It's an exchange or interaction between characters or an internal dialogue for one character, like an internal narration or some kind of realization. That exchange itself takes place in a particular time or place. So that's in the living room, in the person's mind palace, in the house next door, a specific place and time. And there's usually a structure to it. So you have a main or point of view character, usually, doesn't have to be. And so the TLDR of that is that any scene has participants or people who are in the scene, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's going to be consistent pretty much across most contemporary writing. So the skill of making good scenes is not just relevant to books and film. Again, this might be self-explanatory, but I'm going to sort of run it down a little bit. Scenes are essential components in all fiction. And your job as a writer is to sustain tension in small increments through scenes that move the plot or build character or do both. They're sort of like cells in a body. It's the fundamental dramatic unit that make up the entire body of the plot or the story. And in games, we have a little bit of an advantage because scenes are comprised of visual, sonic, and mechanical elements and not just narrative ones. Although the buck does kind of stop with narrative in terms of what should be in the scene, what needs to actually comprise a good scene. And so generally, I like to think of it in the sense that writing for games is about sustaining different types of tension. I've put a few examples down below here of what I think are really great examples of super tense scenecraft. For example, Gone Home, the basement scene in there is extremely tense. The sort of fridge side quest in Control, and sort of the Would You Kindly scene in Bioshock. Very, very late in the game for spoilers about that game. But all three of these demonstrate different types of tension, right? Gone Home, you have sort of this sort of like creeping sense of dread, this idea that something's not right and you're slowly investigating. Control is similar to that, but there's more of like a jump scare element to it. A lot of building and release of tension in games, it ends up being about jump scares, especially in horror games, but it doesn't have to be. In Bioshock, you have this kind of slowly building sense of dread as well, but it's more about sort of the psychological impact and the world impact as well of this realization of the "would you kindly" sort of phrase. So yeah, you have all these different stripes of tension that come together in different ways, emotional, environmental, or sort of physical. And so you might be saying, I'm not making a scary game. There's no jump scares. I'm making like a nice farming simulator. I don't know. How does horror play into this? How does horror play into scenecraft in general? And I'm here to answer that question by saying that horror does scenecraft a little bit differently. Generally, it has one central tenet, which is to scare the reader. It's an emotional tenet, right? And it's centered on that management of emotion, more so than a lot of other genres, with the exception maybe of romance or comedy. Manipulating emotion is part of building tension. And you can use scenes and use sort of a horror sensibility of scenecraft to build tension that pulls players in emotionally really quickly. faster than you would if you're just sort of trying to explain a world or explain sort of a fact about a character in a very sort of common, straightforward way. It's about using tension to center emotion and using emotion to build tension. It sort of feeds into each other. TLDR, game writers and narrative designers can learn and steal from horror writers. It's okay. It happens all the time. But I think that they really have something to learn from each other. And I'm going to give you a few examples of this. Turns out a lot of games implement specific scenes that build off of horror tenets to escalate tension. I don't have time to run through this entire list. I just sort of listed out a few examples of games that we don't necessarily think of as, horror games or scary games, but maybe use horror or use specific horror scenes to build in tension and to pull in the player. A really sort of interesting example for me is how Red Dead 2 uses that sort of horror-esque tension. There are quite a few side quests where you encounter various strange elements, cannibals, vampires, and then there's also the sort of like overarching creeping sense of dread and doom in what is normally sort of a Western drama game, that things are going to go very badly for Arthur for a variety of reasons. That sort of small form pieces of horror can build into something really emotional and really tense that'll really pull in a player. You might say, okay, cool. Why should I care about scene craft? Especially if I'm just, I just plan on writing for games. I don't think I'm going to be doing screenwriting or anything else. And that's because writing for games has a lot more in common with screenwriting than it does programming, for example. This might be like, I don't know if it's hot take, but like a neutral take. There's more you can learn from the sort of art and craft of screenwriting than you would be able to sort of learn with programming. Not to say that you should discount the technical elements, but I really think that there is something that you can learn and should learn from looking across the other media when writing for games, whether that's in other genres or in your own genre. Also, because your favorite story-driven games are comprised of really specifically tuned scenes. Again, some examples below: Her Story, Red Dead 2, Life is Strange. All these are comprised of particular scenes that players remember and really spark a specific emotion in the player. It's centering characters that are in a very specific type of interaction, that are bounded in a very specific and well-illustrated place and time, and are in some kind of emotional turning point or conflict that grows both the plot and the character. And lastly, because all media is a dialogue with other media and you cannot avoid it, you can't do it. A lot of times I find in games, people will sort of solely reference other games, but that's just not the reality of how humans are and how we interact with media in the world. The most obvious example, which I've included here, is Ghost of Tsushima and Kurosawa. That's a very sort of straightforward. They have absolutely talked about that influence many, many times. And I think it's true for a lot of games. It just maybe isn't so on the surface. All of media, especially games media, is a dialogue with everything else in the world, whether it be movies, books, or music, anything else. And sort of how do I do this? I don't necessarily have time to run through this entire thing, but basically study, practice, and implement it. This is a sort of structure that I just apply to anything I want to learn. But you can study prior games that you've played, that you've loved scenes in. You can look at what is operating in your favorite scenes in those games. What characters are active? How are they acting? You can practice that. You can write scenes for that game that don't exist. You can write scenes for games you love, write scenes for games you hate. If you study those tiny building blocks, it can help you build into a way that you can implement it into your practice, into your game project, whether it be in AAA or indie, whatever you want. And that's sort of it. Thank you for coming and listening to me ramble about scenes and why they're important and why craft is important in games writing. My Twitter is on the page, my website, as well as the studio Twitter and website. Wishlist Love Short on Steam. We're releasing this October. Thanks for coming, and I hope you make cool scenes.
Thanks, Emmett, for that wonderful talk. In the meantime, did y'all know that the Game Devs of Color Expo has our own Steam sale going on right now? If you didn't, or you haven't checked it out yet, please go take a peek, see if any of the games vibe with you.